Hello guys, this is Davis here. Welcome back to another video. Now, it's been about 8 months or 9 months since I did the last Westminster chime competition. Well, I'm going to be doing another one. Even though it hasn't been a year yet, I've gotten so many more clocks with Westminster chime. Like, so much more. So, with all that out of the way, I'll show you the competitors. Our first clock is the 2007 Howard Miller grandfather clock. Our second clock is the Asonia Westminster chime wall clock. Our third clock is the Howard Miller triple chime grandfather clock. Our fourth clock is this very expensive Howard Miller grandfather clock. The fifth clock we're going to do is the Colonial grandfather clock. Next we have the New Hamilton schoolhouse regulator wall clock. And right next to it is the old Hamilton schoolhouse regulator wall clock. Next, we have this very rare Howard Miller regulator. Then we have the Howard Miller Daniel. Then we have the Seth Thomas 1930s mantle clock. Next, we have the Review plug-in mantle clock. Then we have the old Big Hamilton bracket mantle clock. After that, we have the small Hamilton bracket mantle clock. Next, we have this German Westminster chime mantle clock. Then we have the famous Howard Miller grandfather clock. Then we have the Colonial grandmother clock. Then we have the New England triple chime grandfather clock. Next we have the Howard Miller baritone. Then we have the Howard Miller Worthington. After that we have the Howard Miller triple chime bracket mantle clock. And finally we have the new Hamilton bracket mantle clock. Okay, so we got all the competitors. Now we're going to start chiming all of them. First on, the 2007 Howard Miller grandfather clock. So here he is. Alright, that was the 2007 Howard Miller grandfather clock. Let's move on. Alright, here's the next clock. The Asonia Westminster chime wall clock. So here we go. Alright, that was the Asonia wall clock. Let's move on. Okay, so here's the third clock. The Howard Miller triple chime grandfather clock. And yes, if anybody's curious, it is on Westminster. So here it is. Alright, that was the Howard Miller triple chime grandfather clock. Let's move on. Alright, here's the fourth competitor. The very expensive Howard Miller grandfather clock. So here it is. Alright, that was the Howard Miller grandfather clock. Let's move on. Alright, here's the fifth clock. The Colonial grandfather clock. Pretty famous clock in my collection. So here it is. Alright, that was the Colonial grandfather clock. Let's move on. Alright, here's the next clock. The New Hamilton, schoolhouse style, Westminster style clock, or whatever. Here it is. Alright, that was the old and the new Hamilton Schoolhouse Regulator Westminster Chime Clock. Now let's just do the old one. It's right next to it. So here we go. Alright, that was the old Hamilton. Let's move on. Alright, here's the next clock. The very rare Howard Miller regulator. So here we go. Alright, that was the very rare Howard Miller regulator. Let's move on. Alright, here's the next clock. The Howard Miller Daniel. So there we go. Alright, that was the Howard Miller Daniel. Let's move on. Alright, here's the next clock. The Seth Thomas 1930s mantle clock. So here we go. Alright, that was the Seth Thomas 1930s Westminster chime mantle clock. Let's move on. Alright, here's the next clock. The Review plug-in clock, which was owned by Rockefeller's wife, which is also known as my great-great-grandma. No, my great-great-grandma. So here it is. Alright, that was the Review plug-in clock. That was Rockefeller's wife's. Let's move on. Alright, here's the next clock. The old big Hamilton bracket mantle clock. So here we go. Alright, that was the old big Hamilton bracket mantle clock. Let's move on. Alright, here's the next clock. The small Hamilton bracket mantle clock. So here it is. Alright, that was the little Hamilton bracket mantle clock. Let's move on. Alright, here's the next clock. The German Westminster chime mantle clock. So here we go. Alright, that was the German Westminster chime mantle clock. Let's move on. Alright, here's one of the most famous Westminster chime clocks, the Howard Miller grandfather clock, like the famous one. So here we go. Alright, that was the famous Howard Miller grandfather clock. Let's move on. Alright, here's the next clock. The colonial grandmother clock. So here we go. Alright, that was the colonial grandmother clock. Let's move on. Alright, here's the next clock. The New England grandfather clock. And yes, if anybody's curious, it's on Westminster. So here we go. Alright, that was the New England grandfather, triple chime grandfather clock. Let's move on. Alright, we have the next clock. The baritone, the Howard Miller baritone. So here it goes. Alright, that was the Howard Miller baritone. Let's move on. Alright, here's the next clock. The Howard Miller Worthington. So here we go. Alright, that was the Howard Miller Worthington. Let's move on. Alright, here's the next clock. The Howard Miller Triple Chime Grand Bracket Mantle Clock. And yes, it's obviously on Westminster. Why do I continue to say that? But here we go. Alright, that was the Howard Miller Triple Chime Grand Bracket Mantle Clock. Let's move on to the final competitor. Alright, here's the final competitor. The new Hamilton, Big Hamilton Grand Bracket Mantle Clock. So here we go. Alright, that was the final competitor. The new big Hamilton Grand Bracket Mantle Clock. Alright, now it's time for you. Yes, you to decide which Westminster chime clock was the best. Leave a comment down below which one is the best. Only one vote per person. Okay? And if I see you put 2 votes, I'm going to delete the comment. This is only votes. No like comments. Okay? Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching. Merry Christmas. Comment, like, and subscribe. And I'll see you guys later. Bye.